Thank you very much for the welcome, and thank you for the opportunity to share some ideas and some thoughts with you tonight. I want to share some thoughts on how a profession like yours, with thousands of members spread across a huge province, can plan, design, and deliver a successful strategic communication strategy. A couple of definitions here. Strategic communications has been described as the synchronization of actions, images, and words to achieve a desired effect. So, I want to talk tonight about how well synchronized your actions, images, and words have been in recent years, and what impact that can have on you, your local association, your federation, and your profession overall. As an outsider, when I study the communications efforts of the Saskatchewan teaching profession, the first thing that screams out is mixed messages. As you look at it from the outside, as a member of the public, interested observer, that's the message that comes across, is that there's a lot of mixed messages out there. So you see and you hear when you look at the media relatively little on the public record as it relates to the teaching profession and how all educational stakeholders can better serve students. There's not a lot about that in terms of the provincial and regional and even local media. Now, you might all be doing incredible work behind the scenes to build partnerships that strengthen education over time, but too often that work has gone unnoticed by the public. In other words, you're missing opportunities to proactively, I want to come back to that word and I want to emphasize that word with you, to proactively talk about your profession and how teachers are working to support and improve educational outcomes for their students. Now, you can't assume anymore that the public knows anything at all about how the education system really works, and or the inspiring professionalism of teachers across the province. And if you don't tell them, simple question, who's going to tell them if it's not you? So what you see and hear most of all in your public communications is the latest developments in collective bargaining and disagreements within your profession over collective bargaining issues, strategies, and outcomes. And more recently, as has already been alluded to, issues related to governance disputes within your federation. So when all of that is the media coverage, what does the public hear and know about teachers as a result? I would argue, as an outsider again, that your profession, they see it as really a union first and foremost, and that issues of wages and working conditions are far more important to you than the quality of education being provided to their children or their grandchildren. That's the impression that people get who aren't spending a lot of time thinking about this and focusing on this, other than what they hear and see in the media. Now, that may not be anyone's intended message or consequence, but it is the result. Remember, too, that in recent months, Saskatchewan parents and grandparents were seeing and hearing all of this discussion about wages and bargaining and other issues like that, and about contracts and bargaining in the context of what was going on in your province of British Columbia, to the west of us. So lots of media coverage related to the strike that was underway with your colleague teachers in British Columbia. And all of this just adds to the view that every time teachers speak, they are hearing union arguments based on self-interest and not necessarily the public interest. Even worse, the public hears and sees differing views in public communications on many of these issues. Now, we can't forget that in today's communications world, everything is public 24/7. There isn't a news cycle that starts in the morning and runs through the noon hour and ends at 6 o'clock with the news anymore. It's a 24/7 business. In addition to the traditional media outlets, every radio, television, and newspaper outlet of any consequence has to feed its website around the clock, so the need for new local content is constant. In addition, all the social media channels, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, YouTube, they all require content, always new content. So you can have the circumstance of your members voting down a tentative agreement, and then being seen and heard to be debating each other on news websites or social media channels about the results and the consequences and what your future bargaining strategy should be. And that's a good discussion to have within your profession internally. It's not necessarily the discussion you want in front of members of the public on a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week basis. Message to the public from all of this. This is a trade union, and it's a trade union that doesn't even have agreement amongst its own members as to what to do next and how to proceed. So unintended or not, the message is you're a trade union that can't even get its own act together. The message is what the public hears over and over. And for governments, it's much easier to dismiss the position of public sector employees who sound more like a trade union than a profession, and who, intended or not, sound to be at odds with each other. Now, normally, when an employer has presented two different tentative contract agreements, which have both been voted down by professionals, the employer would be the one under pressure, you would think. But when the public has heard mixed messages, government gets to say there's a disconnect between the Teachers Federation and the members of the teaching profession. And I'm not here at all as an outsider to argue whether this comment or that comment was accurate or justified or right or wrong. Because at the end of the day, none of that matters to you as professionals long term. What matters is that the public has received mixed messages, and people don't make judgments about who's right and who's wrong within somebody else's professional group. They just make the judgment that that group can't seem to get its act together and can't seem to have a common story that everybody within the group stands behind. They simply judge your entire profession as being incapable of getting its act together or of being focused on something other than the best interests of their child or their grandchild. Now, effective strategic communication is a consistent, collaborative process that needs to see all ambassadors of the brand, and in that case, that's all 13,000 plus. Every teacher across this province, in some way, in their own way individually, as well as together, is an ambassador for your brand of teaching. You need to be somehow on the same page in terms of messages that are shared with the public and with your educational stakeholders. Now, that doesn't for a moment prevent you from debating and exchanging ideas in forums like these and many other forums you have within your profession. But once those discussions have been concluded, you need to find ways to work together to deliver what the majority has agreed to be your key messages. Now, some might argue that the public still has a great deal of confidence in teachers as professionals, in spite of all these communications challenges I talked about. And I want to, there was one slide that I'm going to just pull up. Won't be able to display it to you, but I want to make reference to it because there's some numbers on it that I want to refer to. Yes, it's actual fact that many members of the public think highly of teachers and still think highly of teachers, but that professional credibility can be undermined quickly by mixed messages or ineffective communications. So credibility needs to be earned and renewed on a constant basis. Whatever we thought we won in terms of public debates and discussion in the last generation has to be refought and relearned, retaught in this generation. People don't maintain that for any great length of time. So I want to talk to you about some research from 2013, from last year, where members of the Saskatchewan public were asked to rate their confidence in the professionalism of a number of groups. And in this survey, they were asked to rate their professionalism on a scale from 1 to 5, 5 being the highest. Okay? So when it came to pharmacists, more than 90% of the population rated them a 4 or a 5 out of 5 in terms of their professionalism, okay, and their confidence in their professionalism. Next on that list was nurses. This question didn't ask about registered nurses or LPNs, it just used the term nurses. 82% would rate their confidence in their professionalism a 4 or 5 out of 5. Third on the list was doctors, again, physicians. Not necessarily physician specialists, but just doctors, period. 72%, rating them a 4 or 5 out of 5. And fourth on the list was teachers, at 70%, who would rate their confidence in your professionalism highly, 4 or 5 out of 5. Next, police officers, 64%. And finally, lawyers, the bottom of everybody's list, except for journalists, 47%, in terms of their confidence in their professionalism. So yes, there you sit, highly thought of by a number of members of the Saskatchewan public, but behind pharmacists, nurses, and doctors. Healthcare professions where from time to time there is discussion in the public media about their wages and demands, but more often there is discussion about how they're professionally serving their patients and their clients. The equivalent of that, how you're serving your students and their families. So when you look at that research and you see that number, there's some confidence there to be enjoyed, but the issue is, as you move along with relatively ineffective communications, does that erode over time, or does that improve? Okay? I want to talk about one of the key strategic communications questions that any public sector profession like yours has to deal with, and that's its relationship with government as employer. I urge you to start by realizing that your profession will always have different goals and objectives than government. And it doesn't matter who the government of the day is at any given point in time. Your obligation is to think about the long term as well as the immediate. You're thinking about the next generation of teachers and students as well as today's. And government, no matter who is elected, by contrast, thinks and acts within a 4-year election cycle. And no matter how hard they may try, they just got a different set of goals and objectives, a different horizon than professions like yours will have. So what is the relationship you really want with the government of the day, no matter who that might be? They're your main employer. You want a respectful, professional relationship with your employer, I would assume. Nothing more, but nothing less. If they respect you as professionals, they want to work with you as partners to help determine the future of education and how best to deliver that public education in a thoughtful, inclusive way for your students and their families. So how do you build that kind of respectful relationship with the government as employer? You show over and over that you know that of which you speak. By that I mean you can regularly provide an up-to-date critique on the state of education and suggest workable solutions to change and improve education, backed up by research and professional thought and professional discussion. And you show the ability to government that you can communicate that professional view to the general public in a way that they can both understand and support. Why should any government, no matter who the government is, listen to you and do what you ask them to do if they have no inclination, no view that they're hearing your information coming back to them from members of the public, that they're hearing that the public supports the kinds of positions you're taking related to your profession and educational issues? When a government goes out to the public or to teachers on its own, it needs to see and hear your information reflected in the comments and the reactions it receives. Then your views and positions have real impact with government as employer. I want to just say a couple of words about how all governments approach collective bargaining, the collective bargaining process. Because while the political considerations will be different with different governments, the process is amazingly very similar. Government after government, they go through the same process. Every government will have a committee. It'll be made up of cabinet ministers called the Public Sector Collective Bargaining Committee. And that job of cabinet ministers is to oversee how collective bargaining is going with each and every public sector individually. And at the beginning of each round of bargaining with the public sector unions, the Finance Ministry, with the approval of Treasury Board, another committee of elected officials, of cabinet members, will present the Public Sector Collective Bargaining Committee with what is sometimes called the Public Sector Mandate. You've heard too much about that in the last few years. That is the committee's marching orders, within which they are to try to complete collective bargaining agreements with each public sector union. Now, there's always going to be some wiggle room, as they call it within government, to try to deal with specific problems that are felt by a particular profession, a particular union. In healthcare, it's sometimes market supplement, wage increases for hard to recruit and retain professionals, things of that nature. There's that wiggle room. But the overall framework has really been set before the employer group ever comes to the table. If a public sector union is proving difficult, and more important, if that public sector union is showing an ability to sell their point of view to the public, the employer representatives may go back to the cabinet committee and try to convince them that more is needed to get the job done. They don't do that very often, because that then requires the collective bargaining committee to go back to Treasury Board and Finance and explain that they can't get the job done within the mandate, and please, please, we need more to get the job done. Think about that. That requires the employer negotiating group and at least 2 committees of cabinet ministers, of elected people, to admit that they're unable to get the job done to their colleagues. I just ask you to think about how often you think politicians freely admit that they made a mistake or failed to meet their mandate. It doesn't happen very often. Many public sector employees argue from time to time that the formula for success in collective bargaining for public sector unions is really just for the union and the union bargaining committee and the leadership to just be tougher at the bargaining table. You hear that many times too. To which I say, really, if all it took was a hard-nosed approach at the bargaining table and the threat of job action backed by a strong union with deep pockets, why wouldn't governments have caved into the healthcare providers group over the years? The healthcare providers group has the single largest group of union members in the province, more than 25,000 healthcare workers. 25,000. Nearly double the size of the STA. And they're represented by 3 major public sector unions, QB, SEIU West, and SGEU. They bargain together as a group, although they have individual tables. When it comes to wages and working conditions, basic information like that, they bargain as a group. These unions hardly have a reputation for being pushovers. But yet, over the years, they've settled consistently for the public sector mandate with not a lot of public complaint. They've tried, but haven't been overly successful. Other people will talk about the Saskatchewan Union of Nurses, or SUN, as a model that has forced governments to cave. Yet in the last round of collective bargaining, even SUN settled within the public sector mandate. And in this round, they have yet to settle, which means government hasn't been offering them wage increases like they did in 2008. I call 2008 and that 35% plus increase the perfect storm. It's a once in a lifetime kind of outcome related to a whole lot of things: politics, working conditions, healthcare politics at the time. But it hasn't been repeated since. So how do governments, even in the face of strong opposition from large unions, find the determination to stand their ground and try to always live within that public sector mandate? Well, because governments know that public sector unions are less powerful today than they might have been even a decade ago, even 5 years ago. The public, what governments today call the taxpayers, are more self-interested today than they have ever been. Are they going to be willing to see their taxes go higher to make life better for teachers, doctors, nurses, or anyone else? Not very likely. Are they going to buy the argument that teachers need to be paid more or receive increased classroom support just because it's the right thing to do from the teacher's perspective? Not likely, unless, and this is a big unless, they can be convinced that there is something in it for them. Every new benefit or increase or improved working condition that you receive has to be explained, argued for, and sold as a benefit for those taxpayers, for the members of the public. So traditional union-style arguments and bargaining tactics are fairly easily defensed these days by governments, and they do this knowing that the public will largely be on their side if it ever comes down to a public debate about that. Now, you might want union-like bargaining results, but I argue you and other public sector unions can only get them by showing taxpayers how they're going to benefit from helping you. I put it this way in other places at other times. The message can no longer be to the public, you have to help us. The message to the public, you have to figure out how to tell them, help us, help you. What are they going to get out of this? What are they going to benefit from this that you're asking for in terms of education? Now, you see this new reality reflected in the language that many other public sector employee groups are using these days to argue for increased wages or improved working conditions. In healthcare, where I've got a little bit of experience with specialized healthcare professionals, you'll see the leadership and the membership of unions learning to frame their public comments in terms of related to the public's interest. Public, apostrophe S. I would argue there is less and less of a public interest, a collective interest that taxpayers as a group tend to support, tend to believe in. They see the public's interest as them and their immediate family. So what's in it for them and their immediate family? And they're dealing with this language, these healthcare unions, in the public's interest more than their own self-interest. So they ask questions like this: what will this employer proposal mean for patient waiting lists? You might have heard a little bit about that in the last year or so. How will this employer suggestion hurt public access to needed healthcare services? And how is this service cut putting patients first? It's the government theme, it's the government mandate in healthcare, and they use that to ask, are you living up to your mandate? Are you living up to what you say you're trying to accomplish? Now, do these unions in healthcare adopt this line of argument because they have abandoned unionism? Do they frame their arguments in this way because they no longer believe that their cause is right? Not at all. They make their arguments in this way because they know it provides them with an increased opportunity to be heard, understood, and supported by the public. They make their arguments in this way because ongoing market research shows them that when they frame their comments in the public's interest, in language like that, they can receive anywhere from 75 to 90% support from the general public for their positions. And then they turn around and make exactly the same argument, with exactly the same position, in the traditional language of union self-interest, and that support for the very same view goes down 35 or 40% to barely majority territory. At 75 to 90, you're what I call conventional wisdom. Everybody believes it. Barely in the majority, governments may listen, governments may not listen. It depends on whether or not they think you're getting that message across to enough of the public to affect them in terms of their electoral prospects. These are changes that have occurred in these particular healthcare unions over 2 or 3 rounds of collective bargaining. And those messages are evolving. But they are a fundamental shift from the communications language employed even a few years ago. So there can be change within the union movement, within public sector unions, to emphasize professionalism and to emphasize the public's interest as opposed to self-interest. So, I've been talking tonight about some of the fundamental communications challenges you face as a profession, and now I want to quickly focus, just to conclude, on how to overcome those challenges and improve your communications efforts going forward. You'll recall the strategic communications definition I shared with you at the beginning. Strategic communications is the synchronization of actions, images, and words to achieve a desired effect. How can you, as individual teachers, work together to improve your profession's strategic communications? Think about that, and in your discussions as an association members and as individual teachers, think about ways you can get your message across as a profession to more and more members of the public than you are today. And then how can your local association work together with teachers from across the province to help your profession adapt to this changing communications reality? The STA and other local associations have that obligation to bring your messages, to bring your ideas forward within the Federation, within the profession. How can your profession develop and deliver a meaningful social media strategy that both informs and serves? Informs the public and serves your members. As an outsider, it's amazing to me how little social media activity there is from 13,000 teachers. I know all about Facebook pages, and I know, but something that happened during President's Day, there was a group discussion, and some ideas that came back from the tables. I'll just share one with you. When you say, well, what can we do as individual teachers, locally, in our own classrooms? And they came up with the idea that, you know what, we've all got our own Twitter accounts, personally, quite often. We all have our Facebook pages from time to time. Why are we not, more than we are today, all 13,000 of us, or a large percentage of us, letting the world know what we're doing? By that I mean, at 8 o'clock at night, here we are with the latest football team that's going on to the provincial championships, and how proud you are to be there working with. The latest concert in terms of the arts that you're doing rehearsals for. And this is not a teacher complaining about their working conditions and complaining about their hours of work. It's a teacher letting the public know how dedicated and committed they are to doing that work with their children and their grandchildren. And ask yourself, what kind of impact even 5,000 other 13,000 of that kind of constant reinforcement of the professional work you're doing, what would that mean to the public's view about the professionalism of teachers across the province? If that were what they, if that was what they saw and heard much more than anything to do with collective bargaining. So, and finally, a question about how do you shift the debate and reduce the focus on collective bargaining and increase the focus on professional standards in education and outcomes. Shift the debate from what the public sees as self-interest to the public's interest. And with that kind of dedication, that kind of work, you can ultimately get everyone in a group of 13,000 or more members on the same page, because you'll be talking about many of the same things and leading towards a similar goal. Providing consistent messages to the public, because the public is both weary and wary of mixed messages. So I believe these are the kinds of fundamental questions teachers and their organizations across the province will be discussing, need to be discussing and debating, so that you can improve strategic communications for all teachers going forward. Sorry to take so much of your time, but thank you very much. Appreciate it.